After a long moment I felt her stiffen. She was looking towards the square. "Don't think of Nicholas," she said. "They were waiting, and they are listening. They are hearing everything that goes on in our minds." "But what are they thinking?" I whispered. "What is going on in their heads?" I could feel her concentration. I pressed her close and looked straight at the silver light that came through the distant open doors. I could hear them too now, but just that low shimmer of sound coming from all of them collected there. But as I stared at the rain, there came over me the strongest sense of peace. It was almost sensuous. It seemed to me we could yield to them, that it was foolish to resist them further. All things would be resolved were we merely to go out to them and give ourselves over. They would not torture Nicholas, whom they had in their power. They would not tear him limb from limb. I saw Nicholas in their hands. He wore only his lace shirt and breeches, because they had taken the coat. And I heard his screams as they pulled his arms from the sockets. I cried out no, putting my own hand over my mouth, so that I did not arouse the mortals in the church. Gabrielle reached up and touched my lips with her fingers. "It's not being done to him," she said under her breath. "It's merely a threat. Don't think of him." "He's still alive then," I whispered. "So they want us to believe. Listen." There came again the sense of peace, the summons, that's what it was, to join them, the voice saying, "Come out of the church. Surrender to us. We welcome you, and we will not harm either of you. If only you come." I turned towards the door and rose to my feet. Anxiously, Gabrielle rose beside me, cautioning me again with her hand. She seemed weary of even speaking to me as we both looked at that great archway of silvery light. "You are lying to us," I said. "You have no power over us." It was a rolling current of defiance moving through the distant door. "Surrender to you? If we do that, then what's to stop you from holding the three of us? Why should we come out? Within this church we are safe. We can conceal ourselves in its deepest burial vaults. We can hunt among the faithful, drink their blood in the chapels and niches so skillfully we'd never be discovered, sending our victims out confused to die in the streets afterwards. And what would you do? You, who cannot even cross the door. Besides, we don't believe you have Nicholas. Show him to us. Let him come to the door and speak." Gabrielle was in a welter of confusion. She was scanning me, desperate to know what I said. And she was clearly hearing them, which I could not do when I was sending these impulses. It seemed their pulse weakened, but it had not stopped. It went on as it had before, as if I'd not answered it, as if it were someone humming. It was promising truce again, and now it seemed to speak of rapture, that in the great pleasure of joining with it all conflict would be resolved. It was sensuous again, it was beautiful. "Miserable cowards, the lot of you," I sighed. I said the words aloud this time so that Gabrielle could hear as well. "Send Nicholas into the church." The hum of the voices became thin. I went on, but beyond it there was a hollow silence, as if other voices had been withdrawn and only one or two remained now. Then I heard the thin, chaotic strains of argument and rebellion. Gabrielle's eyes narrowed. Silence. Only mortals out there now, weaving their way against the wind across the Place de Grève. I didn't believe they would withdraw. Now, what do we do to save Nicky? I blinked my eyes. I felt weary suddenly. It was almost a feeling of despair. And I thought confusedly, this is ridiculous. I never despair. Others do that. Not me. I go on fighting no matter what happens, always. And in my exhaustion and anger, I saw Magnus leaping and jumping in the fire. I saw the grimace of his face before the flames consumed him. And he disappeared. Was that despair? The thought paralyzed me, horrified me as the reality of it had done then. And I had the oddest feeling that someone else was speaking to me of Magnus. That is why the thought of Magnus had come into my head. "Too clever," Gabrielle whispered. "Don't listen to it. It's playing tricks with our very thoughts," I said. But as I stared past her at the open doorway, I saw a small figure appear. Compact it was, the figure of a young boy, not a man. I ached for it to be Nicholas, but knew immediately that it was not. It was smaller than Nicholas, though rather heavier of build, and the creature was not human. Gabrielle made some soft, wondering sound. It sounded almost like prayer in its reference. The creature wasn't dressed as men dress now. Rather, he wore a belted tunic, very graceful, and stockings on his well-shaped legs. His sleeves were deep, hanging at his sides. He was clothed like Magnus, actually, and for one moment I thought madly that by some magic it was Magnus's return. Stupid thought, if this was a boy, as I had said, and he had a head of long curly hair. And he walked very straight and very simply through the silvery light and into the church. He hesitated for a moment, and by the tilt of the head it seemed he was looking up. And then he came on through the nave and towards us, his feet making not the faintest sound on the stones. He moved into the glow of the candles on the side altar. His clothes were black velvet, once beautiful, and now eaten away by time and crusted with dirt. But his face was shining white and perfect, the countenance of a god it seemed, a Cupid out of Caravaggio, seductive yet ethereal, with auburn hair and dark brown eyes. I held Gabrielle closer as I looked at him, and nothing so startled me about him, this inhuman creature, as the manner in which he was staring at us. He was inspecting every detail of our persons, and then he reached out very gently and touched the stone of the altar at his side. He stared at the altar, at its crucifix and its saints, and then he looked back to us. He was only a few yards away, and the soft inspection of us yielded to an expression that was almost sublime. And the voice I'd heard before came out of this creature, summoning us again, calling upon us to yield, saying with indescribable gentleness that we must love one another, he and Gabrielle, whom he didn't call by name, and I. There was something naive about it, his sending the summons as he stood there. I held fast against him instinctively. I felt my eyes becoming opaque, as if a wall had gone up to seal off the windows of my thoughts. And yet I felt such a longing for him, such a longing to fall into him, and follow him and be led by him, that all my longings of the past seemed nothing at all. He was all mystery to me as Magnus had been, only he was beautiful, indescribably beautiful, and there seemed in him an infinite complexity and depth which Magnus had not possessed. The anguish of my immortal life pressed in on me. He said, come to me, because only I and my like can end the loneliness you feel. It touched a well of inexpressible sadness. It sounded the depth of the sadness, and my throat went dry with a powerful little knot where my voice might have been, yet I held fast. We two are together, I insisted, tightening my grip on Gabrielle. And then I asked him, where is Nicholas? I asked that question and clung to it, yielding to nothing that I heard or saw. He moistened his lips, very human thing to do, and silently he approached us until he was standing no more than 2 feet from us, looking from one of us to the other, and in a voice very unlike a human voice, he spoke. Magnus, he said. It was unobtrusive, it was caressing. He went into the fire, as you said? I never said it, I answered. The human sound of my own voice startled me. But I knew now he meant my thoughts of only moments before. It's quite true, I answered. He went into the fire. Why should I deceive anyone on that account? I tried to penetrate his mind. He knew I was doing it, and he threw up against me such strange images that I gasped. What was it I'd seen for an instant? I didn't even know. Hell and heaven? Or both made one, vampires in a paradise, drinking blood? From the very flowers that hung, pendulous and throbbing from the trees, I felt a wave of disgust. It was as if he had come into my private dreams like a succubus. But he had stopped. He let his eyes pucker slightly, and he looked down out of some vague respect. My disgust was withering him. He hadn't anticipated my response. He hadn't expected... what? Such strength? Yes. And he was letting me know it in an almost courteous way. I returned the courtesy. I let him see me in the tower room with Magnus. I recall Magnus's words before he went into the fire. I let him know all of it. He nodded, and when I told the words Magnus had said, there was a slight change in his face, as if his forehead had gone smooth or all of his skin had tightened. He gave me no such knowledge of himself in answer. On the contrary, much to my surprise, he looked away from us to the main altar of the church. He glided past us, turning his back to us as if he had nothing to fear from us, and had for the moment forgotten us. He moved towards the great aisle, and slowly up it but he did not appear to walk in a human way. Rather, he moved so swiftly from one bit of shadow to another that he seemed to vanish and reappear. Never was he visible in the light, and those scores of souls milling in the church had only to glance at him for him to instantly disappear. I marveled at his skill, because that is all it was, and curious to see if I could move like that, I followed him to the choir. Gabrielle came after without a sound. I think we both found it simpler than we had imagined it would be, yet he was clearly startled when he saw us at his side. And in the very act of being startled, he gave me a glimpse of his great weakness, pride. He was humiliated that we had crept up on him, moving so lightly and managing at the same time to conceal our thoughts. But worse was to come. When he realized that I had perceived this, It was revealed for a split second. He was doubly enraged. A withering heat emanated from him that wasn't heat at all. Gabrielle made a little scornful sound. Her eyes flashed on him for a second in some shimmer of communication between them that excluded me. He seemed puzzled, but he was in the grip of some greater battle I was struggling to understand. He looked at the faithful around him, and at the altar and all the emblems of the Almighty and the Virgin Mary everywhere that he turned. He was perfectly the god out of Caravaggio, the light playing on the hard whiteness of his innocent-looking face. Then he put his arm about my waist, slipping it under my cloak. His touch was so strange, so sweet and enticing, and the beauty of his face so entrancing that I didn't move away. He put his other arm around Gabrielle's waist, and the sight of them together, angel and angel, distracted me. He said, "You must come." "Why? Where?" Gabrielle asked. I felt an immense pressure. He was attempting to move me against my will, but he could not. I planted myself on the stone floor. I saw Gabrielle's face harden as she looked at him, and again he was amazed. He was maddened, and he couldn't conceal it from us. So he had underestimated our physical strength as well as our mental strength. "Interesting. You must come now," he said, giving me the great force of his will, which I could see much too clearly to be fooled. "Come out, and my followers won't harm you." "You're lying to us," I said. "You sent your followers away, and you want us to come out before your followers return, because you don't want them to see you come out of the church. You don't want them to know you came into it." Again Gabrielle gave a little scornful laugh. I put my hand on his chest and tried to move him away. He might have been as strong as Magnus, but I refused to be afraid. "Why don't you want them to see?" I whispered, peering into his face. The change in him was so startling and so ghastly that I found myself holding my breath. His angelic countenance appeared to wither, his eyes widening and his mouth twisting down in consternation. His entire body became quite deformed, as if he were trying not to grit his teeth and clench his fists. Gabrielle drew away. I laughed. I didn't really mean to, but I couldn't help it. It was horrifying, but it was also very funny. With stunning suddenness, this awful illusion, if that is what it was, faded, and he came back to himself. Even the sublime expression returned. He told me in a steady stream of thought that I was infinitely stronger than he supposed, but it would frighten the others to see him emerge from the church, and so we should go at once. "Lies again," Gabrielle whispered, and I knew this much pride would forgive nothing. God help Nicholas if we couldn't trick this one. Turning, I took Gabrielle's hand and we started down the aisle to the front doors. Gabrielle glancing back at him and to me questioningly, her face white and tense. "Patience," I whispered. I turned to see him far away from us, his back to the main altar, and his eyes were so big as he stared that he looked horrible to me, loathsome, like a ghost. When I reached the vestibule, I sent out my summons to the others with all my power, and I whispered aloud for Gabrielle as I did so. I told them to come back and into the church if they wanted to, that nothing could harm them. Their leader was inside the church, standing at the very altar, unharmed. I spoke the words louder, pumping the summons under the words, and Gabrielle joined me, repeating the phrases in unison with me. I felt him coming towards us from the main altar, and then suddenly I lost him. I didn't know where he was behind us. He grabbed hold of me suddenly, materializing at my side, and Gabrielle was thrown to the floor. He was attempting to lift me and pitch me through the door, but I fought him. And desperately collecting everything I remembered of Magnus, his strange walk, and this creature's strange manner of moving, I hurled him, not off balance as one might do to a heavy mortal, but straight up in the air, just as I had suspected. He went over in a somersault, crashing into the wall. Mortals stirred. They saw movement, heard noises, but he'd vanished again, and Gabrielle and I looked no different from other young gentlemen in the shadows. I motioned for Gabrielle to get out of the way. Then he appeared, shooting towards me, but I perceived what was to happen and stepped aside. Some 20 feet away from me, I saw him sprawled on the stones, staring at me with positive awe, as if I were a god. His long auburn hair was tossed about, his brown eyes enormous as he looked up. And for all the gentle innocence of his face, his will was rolling over me, a hot stream of commands telling me I was weak and imperfect and a fool, and I would be torn limb from limb by his followers as soon as they appeared. They would roast my mortal lover slowly till he died. I laughed silently. This was as ludicrous as a fight out of the old commedia. Gabrielle was staring from one to the other of us. I sent the summons again to the others, and this time when I sent it, I heard them answering, questioning. "Come into the church." I repeated it over and over, even as he rose and ran at me again in blind and clumsy rage. Gabrielle caught him just as I did, and we both had hold of him, and he couldn't move. In a moment of absolute horror for me, he tried to sink his fangs into my neck. I saw his eyes round and empty as the fangs descended over his drawn lip. I flung him back, and again he vanished. They were coming nearer, the others. "He's in the church, your leader. Look at him." I repeated it. "And any of you can come into the church. You won't be hurt." I heard Gabrielle let out a scream of warning, and too late. He rose up right in front of me as if out of the floor itself and struck my jaw, jerking my head back so that I saw the church ceiling. And before I could recover, he had dealt me one fine blow in the middle of the back that sent me flying out the door and onto the stones of the square.